Up in just a moment, live coverage of the House of Representatives will take you to the floor where lawmakers will convene momentarily. And, of course, the big issue today, voting on a CR, a continuing resolution that keeps the government in operation through mid-December, but also defunds the president's health care law. Thanks for being with us on this Friday. Enjoy your weekend.
The House will be in order. The chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., September 20th, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Virginia Fox to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
The prayer will be offered by our chaplain, Father Conroy.
Let us pray. Loving God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. Bless the members who are laboring through these challenging days with wisdom, magnanimity, and a shared desire to serve our nation at a pivotal time for us all. May their efforts bring results that rise above any sense of victory for one side or the other, but rather mutual benefit. In the end, may we continue to trust that you would not abandon those who put their trust in you. May all that is done this day be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
Amen. The chairs examine the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House her approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams.
Would you join me, please? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The chair will entertain up to 5 requests for 1 minute on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, regretfully this week we had to wish TransCanada an unhappy 5th birthday. They have now been waiting for 5 years since first applying for the permit for the construction of the Keystone Pipeline. Even though this anniversary was an unfortunate milestone, what is fortunate is the southern leg of the Keystone Pipeline will be completed by the end of 2013. However, the delay of the northern leg puts 4,000 people on hold for work. Today, the southern leg is on day 410 of construction, and the hard-working Americans who devoted time and effort deserve these jobs. While this administration promotes a job-focused agenda, it continues to cripple our nation's entrepreneurial spirit. It's time we move past the rhetoric and make sure America continues moving forward. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise to ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
10 days, Mr. Speaker. We have 10 short days before this government could shut down. Yet today, after working only 9 days this month, Congress is about to go on recess. We shouldn't be leaving here today. We should be staying, working, coming to a real agreement, not some partisan ploy. If the government shuts down, our military, active duty military, could face working without pay. Their families could suffer. Our veterans who are already facing unreasonable wait times could go with delayed benefits. And seniors who have paid for years into Social Security and Medicare may not get the services that they need. This is completely unacceptable. Americans are sick and tired of partisan fighting. They want Congress to do their job and work. Let's put their economic security first. Let's actually pass a reasonable budget. Let's rebuild a middle class. 10 days, Mr. Speaker. Let's do our work. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. 41, 19, 5, and 0. Mr. Speaker, the House has voted 41 times to defund, dismantle, and repeal the President's disastrous health care law. 19 provisions of Obamacare have been successfully amended, repealed, or delayed. The Obama administration has delayed 5 significant provisions of the law, and Harry Reid and the Senate have not once brought a vote to the Senate floor. Mr. Speaker, as a business owner, I know that businesses don't want Obamacare. They're being forced to cut employees and hours. Labor unions don't want the law. They unsuccessfully lobbied the White House to be exempt. Families don't want it. They're seeing their premiums skyrocket and their current health care plans disappear. Even IRS agents tasked with implementing and enforcing the law don't want it. IRS Acting Commissioner Daniel Werfel said IRS employees don't want changes to their health care. And the majority of Americans don't want it. Everybody's seeking exemptions. Mr. Speaker, today the House will vote for the 42nd time to defund Obamacare and keep the government running while the Senate has yet to act. Now is the time for our senators to stand up and demand Harry Reid to bring this vote to the floor. America is waiting on them to join us in a fight to get rid of Obamacare, the worst legislation in our lifetime. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to recognize an important breakthrough in the statistics and neuroscience research. Neurological conditions are caused by the brain's communication networks, and these conditions can be studied at the systems level. Functional MRIs capture 3D images of the brain over time, resulting in millions of measurements per subject and billions of possible connections. A Rice University statistics professor, Guinevere Allen, and her collaborators recently developed statistical methods to model how each individual's brain is wired, and then applied these methods to synesthesia, a condition in which individuals automatically associate specific colors with numbers and letters. The team discovered that the areas of the brain responsible for processing colors are functionally connected to the areas that process letters and numbers in synthesis. This breakthrough is relevant to other neurological diseases such as autism and Alzheimer's, and demonstrates how statistical science is vital to neuroscience research. I urge my colleagues to support critical science funding so that this type of work may continue.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Indiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the chamber for 1 minute. I'd like to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today, Madam Speaker, to discuss the economy and jobs. The White House believes we're moving in the right direction. For most Americans, especially those 4.3 million Americans who've been out of work for more than 27 weeks, that is just not good enough. Progress is not happening. Sadly, our nation's labor participation rate now stands at 63.2%, the lowest rate since 1978. The news for our younger Americans is even more sobering. This year, collective student debt loan toppled $1 trillion, and a recent poll by Accenture found that 41% of recent college graduates were underemployed relative to their education, making paying off those student loans extremely hard. And what can we do to speed up job creation? Well, folks from the Indiana Chamber of Commerce visited me this week, and they said we must reduce uncertainty. Washington can do that by solving our fiscal challenges, reforming our regulatory system, and stopping the job-killing taxes and disincentives set up by Obamacare. House Republicans have a clear plan to create jobs and stimulate our economy, and it's time for our friends across the aisle to realize this status quo is not acceptable. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As we all know, on September 30th, the government will run out of funding, and I rise today to urge my colleagues here in Congress to stop the partisan bickering, to stop the games, and to work to avoid a government shutdown. For folks back home on the Olympic Peninsula and around Puget Sound, a shutdown would have serious consequences. Troops at Joint Base Lewis McChord and workers at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard could go without pay. Olympic National Park could close to tourists. Senior citizens could be delayed in receiving checks for Social Security. Veterans may go without the benefits and care that they have earned. Madam Speaker, I spent the last 10 years working in economic development. The main thing that employers want from government is trust and predictability. And now, between sequestration and a potential government shutdown, Congress is on the cusp of fracturing both. What my constituents want is for us to get to work, to solve our nation's problems, not to make them worse. That's why we need to pass legislation as quickly as possible to avert this shutdown and then move forward on a bipartisan, balanced budget that the American people deserve. Madam Speaker, I yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
I ask the unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to congratulate the 852 employees of United Launch Alliance in Decatur, Alabama, for their hard work and commitment both to their jobs and to America. Because of their dedication when using the United Launch Alliance, America has secure access to space 100% of the time. 2 days ago, on September 18, 2013, ULA completed their 75th successful launch using an Atlas V rocket at Cape Canaveral. This was ULA's 4th launch in 2 months, 9th launch this year, and 40th successful launch of the Atlas V rocket. Mr. Speaker, I rise to recognize the United Launch Alliance and workers of Decatur for their achievement that embodies American exceptionalism. It is an honor to represent you in Congress. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Speaker, I would like to address the House for 1 minute with your permission.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, tragedy happens. We say we're shocked. This is a quiet neighborhood. This was a quiet town. This is a quiet city. When you examine the mass shootings in America over the last decade, it becomes abundantly clear that there are serious cultural and spiritual problems that have not been recognized. Any attempt to be reasonable, thoughtful, earnest to face the recognized horror is, even in the Congress of the United States, met with downright skepticism or outright hate. I wonder if we want to resolve this unique national paralysis. Somewhere between taking everyone's guns away and maintaining the status quo, we must find a workable answer. Do senators and House members have to be directly threatened before we agree to work together? One of our own has been shot down in our own district. We all said all the appropriate things and didn't do anything to prevent this kind of violence from happening again. It would seem to me, Madam Speaker, to be very desirable to review the biography, at least, of any person who applies to own a gun. Oversight of the process could be left to citizens representing the entire gun issue. We won't accept these violent acts in America any longer. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, when I talk to folks back home in my rural Missouri district, it remains clear that our families and businesses want to defund Obamacare. As time goes on, the list of problems with the President's health care mandate continues to get longer. The reality of rising premiums, job-killing mandates, and jeopardized patient care are proof that this unworkable legislation must be stopped. Today, the House of Representatives will vote to defund President Obama's health care law. The vote will be a victory for my constituents who are adamantly opposed to Obamacare and the disastrous impact it will have on our rural economy. After the House of Representatives votes to defund Obamacare today, the United States Senate must justify to the American people why Obamacare is too harmful for businesses but should still be forced on families and individuals. The Senate must justify why special interests are eligible for waivers and delays while average Americans will be hit with Obamacare's tsunami of mandates fines, and confusions. Madam Speaker, I urge the United States Senate to follow the House's lead and defund Obamacare.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, Social Security is one of the most successful programs of the federal government. However, many Americans don't realize that the wealthy pay a lower rate on taxable income into Social Security. With Senator Harkin, Representative Linda Sanchez and I, along with many co-sponsors, have introduced legislation to scrap the wage cap on payroll taxes. Most Americans will no doubt think it is more fair that everyone pays the same rate, and the bill would stop the misguided claims that Social Security needs to be changed or scrapped, and it would allow increased monthly benefits. It would also provide a cost of living allowance that better reflects the actual cost of living for seniors. I ask my colleagues to join us in this effort.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 352, I call up House Joint Resolution 59, making continuing appropriations for the fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 59, Joint Resolution making continuing appropriations for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 352, the amendment printed in House Report 113-216 is adopted, and the joint resolution as amended is considered read. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers, and the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Lowy, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the consideration of H.J. Res. 59, and that I may include tabular material on the same.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself 5 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, the continuing resolution that we bring up today will keep the government operating into the next fiscal year. The base CR is straightforward. It's clean, it's short-term, it continues reductions in federal discretionary spending, But most importantly, Madam Speaker, it will prevent a government shutdown. The legislation also includes an amendment to the base bill, which adds the text of H.R. 2682, the Defund Obamacare Act of 2013, and the text of H.R. 807, the Full Faith and Credit Act. HJ-RES will fund the government for the first 76 days of fiscal year 2014 until December 15th, 2013. It provides $986.3 billion in funding, approximately the same rate as the current post-sequestration level, with some minor adjustments. The base bill is extremely clean. Additional provisions were only added in a very limited number of cases where adjustments were needed to prevent catastrophic shortfalls or unintended disruptions to critical programs or services. It simply keeps the lights on in our government to provide for the safety, security, and well-being of all Americans. I'd like to remind my colleagues, Madam Speaker, both in the House and the other body, that a government shutdown is a political game in which everyone loses. It shirks one of our most basic duties as members of Congress, and it puts our national security at stake. To be clear, if this legislation is not enacted and we embark on a government shutdown, the consequences are severe. Our brave men and women in uniform don't get paid. Our recovering economy will take a huge hit. And our most vulnerable citizens, including the elderly and the veterans who rely on critical government programs and services, could be left high and dry. A government shutdown, even the illusion of the threat of a shutdown, says to the American people that this Congress does not have their best interests at heart. This continuing resolution keeps this Congress moving in the right direction. It gives us time to solve the urgent fiscal issues facing our nation, finding a balanced and attainable plan that eliminates sequestration, implements careful reforms for both discretionary and mandatory spending, and keeps our economy growing. It is my hope that the House will pass this bill today and that the Senate will act in short order so that this matter will be wrapped up well before the deadline on the 30th. So I urge my colleagues to do their jobs as members of the House and to do what's best for this country and vote yes on this bill today. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I will oppose this continuing resolution. On September 10th, Chairman Rogers introduced the CR, and his statement noted, "This bill is free of controversial riders and does not seek to change existing federal policy." How things have changed. Unfortunately, this new package will attach not one, but two politically motivated, ill-conceived, doom provisions. One directs the President to pay certain debts, but not others, in case House Republicans are determined to default on America's obligations. The other would defund the Affordable Care Act. Defunding the Affordable Care Act has far-reaching consequences for all Americans. If the House CR is enacted, no funds could be used to administer payments calculated on the basis of ACA provisions. Patients, doctors, hospitals, medical suppliers, and other health providers would all experience significant disruptions. Many of the improvements to Medicare made by the ACA would also have to be suspended, such as better coverage for preventive services, lower costs for drug benefits, stronger tools to combat health care fraud. Most importantly, undermining the implementation of the ACA only gives our medical choices back to the insurance companies and keeps health insurance costs much too high for too many families. The House Republican default plan is flawed as well. The majority proposes that if they force default on federal debt, the U.S. should prioritize payments to Treasury bondholders, of which 47% are foreign-owned. So while we pay back China, the following Americans would be pushed to the back of the line: 1.4 million active duty troops, 780,000 troops in reserve, 3.4 million disabled veterans who served the country with honor, 1.1 million doctors and others who provide health care to seniors with Medicare, 32 million children in schools that need payments to continue serving nutritious lunches, 44,000 National Institutes of Health grantees conducting life-saving medical research and providing an estimated 500,000 jobs. We, my colleagues, should be focused on jobs, putting people to work. Instead, the Republicans want to play games of brinkmanship on the budget and the debt limit, even though the foreseeable consequence will be plummeting stock markets and businesses freezing their hiring. The Republican budget plan itself shortchanges American jobs in infrastructure, results in education and defense layoffs, closes Head Start and after-school programs, and divests in health research. And the sequester, CBO tells us, will cost the United States economy up to 1.6 million jobs over the next year. I hope at some point we are able to agree on a bipartisan CR that can be enacted. The one before us, unfortunately, is not it. Unfortunately, we'll be back here again next week facing the same crisis. I yield back. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee on Appropriation, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. FRELINGHUYSEN.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in support of the continuing resolution. I do so with no small amount of frustration since Ranking Member Chapter and I worked hard on our energy and water bill, putting months of work into it. It's passed the House and now it's held up. Ours was a tough but a balanced bill. We made some difficult choices to get under the $960 billion cap set by this House while still funding our nation's critical priorities: strong national defense, the work of the Army Corps of Engineers, and yes, the work of the Department of Energy. And all that work will be thrown away unless we deal with sequestration and get back to what we call regular order. Coming up with an approach to manage, or perhaps best eliminate sequestration, is going to take some time. As those decisions are being made, our nation must be kept open for business, and government must provide critical services. If the government shutdowns, many of those services will not be funded. Military personnel will not be paid, and their families will suffer. And this would be an unpardonable breach of trust to our men and women in uniform. Under the jurisdiction of our committee, Energy and Water Bill, many Army Corps engineers' activities would quickly grind to a halt, and that includes the dredging of waterways critical to American jobs and businesses and work on flood control structures such as levees. And at our national laboratories, critical and time-sensitive work to maintain the reliability of our nuclear weapons would also slow down, and that would be unconscionable. And our work overseas to ensure that nuclear weapons materials are kept out of the hands of those who would do our country harm would also be curtailed. Colleagues, the continuing resolution before us is a limited temporary measure which includes no objectionable provisions and ensures that the government keeps its obligations to the American people. It deserves passage so the Senate can quickly begin its consideration of the measure. I thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from New Jersey is recognized.
I am very pleased to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Levin.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes. Without objection.
This bill defunds still more than the Affordable Care Act. It undermines Medicare. It would end improvements in new prescription drug benefits, increases costs for those with Medicare Advantage, and hurts children covered by CHIP as well as the disabled. But this measure has still more peril for our country. We in the House are like two ships passing in the night. House Republicans will pass this bill. It will sail off to the Senate, surely to return after the Senate has stripped off the effort to defund the Affordable Care Act. So then it will be squarely up to the Speaker of this House. Will he act as the captain of the entire House of Representatives, or remain a captive of his right-wing Republican mates? Will he, as he acts, worry mainly about the risk to his speakership, or the risk to our entire nation? House Republicans taking the ship over the cliff would take the nation's economic well-being with it. This is the inevitable danger of the course being chosen today by House Republicans, and only those blinded by rigid ideology can fail to see it. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Appropriations, gentleman from Texas, Mr. Carter.
The gentleman from Texas recognized for 2 minutes.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, for years I have pushed for the return to regular order. This short-term CR will allow us to do just that by giving us time to finalize a broader budget deal, complete the fiscal year 2014 appropriations bill, and get our nation's fiscal house in order by getting the budget process back in regular order. Our appropriations process matters. It matters for the oversight of the sprawling federal bureaucracy. It matters to control our government spending. And it is a basic duty of the Congress that is explicitly spelled out in the United States Constitution. This is necessary so a base CR prevents a disastrous government shutdown that no one wants and would especially harm our men and women in uniform. But I urge the Senate to pass this and the President to sign it into law as soon as possible to avoid a devastating and avoidable government shutdown. Furthermore, this bill responds to the clear will of the American people by defunding Obamacare, a tremendously flawed law that is casting havoc upon businesses and citizens alike, and that must be repealed. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the leadership you are giving us on this bill, and I thank you for your commitment to regular order and to ensuring that in the next few weeks we wrap up FY14 process the right way by conferencing all 12 appropriations bills. I urge the members to support this CR. I look forward to a quick passage by the Senate and the signature by the President to keep the government running and to avoid a needless shutdown. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
You ready? Not. He's not ready.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I'm pleased to reserve and yield to my good friend, Chairman Rogers.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Subcommittee on Appropriations, gentleman from Texas, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, today the constitutional conservatives in the House are keeping their word to our constituents and our nation to stand true to our principles, to protect them from the most unpopular law ever passed in the history of the country, Obamacare, that intrudes on their privacy. Our most sacred right as Americans is to be left alone. And we have also kept our word today in this continuing resolution to ensure that our government continues to operate while we negotiate in good faith with the President and with the Senate to find a way forward. Our short-term continuing resolution fully funds every aspect of the government. In fact, it's important for people to remember that the Senate has had the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs bill for over 3 months, so they could have passed it a long time ago. The Senate has had the defense appropriations bill since late July, so they could have passed that bill a long time ago and put it on the President's desk, and we could have been sure that our military would be paid. The Senate has had the Department of Homeland Security bill since early June, and they've done nothing. The Senate has had the Energy and Water bill since July 10th and have done nothing. So we have done our job. We in the House, the constitutional conservative majority, have kept our word to our constituents and to the nation to do our job, to fund the essential aspects of the government, and to ensure that we've done everything in our power to protect our constituents from the most unpopular piece of legislation ever passed in the history of the Congress, Obamacare, by permanently and totally defunding it while protecting the core functions of the government. It's essential that we pass this continuing resolution today from the perspective of our veterans to ensure that we have the funding available to handle the disability claims backlog, to ensure that we have the resources necessary for the military to continue to build the facilities they need around the world to ensure that our men and women have everything they need to protect this great nation and our freedom in every corner of the planet. I urge my members to join me in supporting this continuing resolution and to keep our word to defund Obamacare.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I am very pleased to yield 5 minutes to the outstanding ranking member of the Defense Subcommittee of Appropriations.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate the gentlewoman yielding. And at the beginning of my remarks, I would want to acknowledge that I have made a mistake and that I have been wrong for the nearly 3 decades I have served in the United States Congress. And I regret to have to admit that. But this morning, in anticipation of today's debate, I took a look at Article 1 of the Constitution and realized in Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 7, I have been misreading it all of these years as a member of the Appropriations Committee. The paragraph reads, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of a continuing resolution." The Constitution says nothing about appropriations, apparently, because since fiscal year 07, this chamber and the United States Senate, the Congress collectively, should have enacted, made discrete decisions, fought about legislation, 84 appropriation bills. We have individually enacted 9. I am appalled that in late July, early August, the last couple of weeks, every member I have talked to in this chamber on both sides of the aisle, senior and new, have said if we can only do a continuing resolution, we can prevent the shutdown of the United States government. Today in the United States Congress, we consider it a success if all we do is pass a continuing resolution to do what we did in fiscal year 13, if we did what we did in fiscal year 12, if we did what we did in fiscal year 11 and 10 and 9 and 8 and 7. We are governing this country by looking backwards. We have a responsibility to make decisions. And I want to remind my colleagues, just on the defense portion of this bill, some of the initiatives that will now not take place because of the continuing resolution. Under the leadership of Chairman Young and the members of that subcommittee, one of our initiatives is to cut $153.5 million for unjustified cost growth of the Joint Strike Fighter. One of the initiatives we would like to enact into law but cannot under the continuing resolution is for the EA-18G. We want to cut $131.4 million for carryovers and cost growth. What we would like to do, if we could legislate in this body, is for the F-18, we would like to trim $104 million. Imagine that, cutting the defense budget by $104 for cost growth and funding that is not needed in the coming fiscal year. The Next Generation Jammer, $99.9 million. We would like to reduce. Why? Because of poor program execution and contract delays. Within the last couple of months, we had a failed ballistic missile defense test. We would like to reduce that account, take the initiative to cut it by $110 million. But let's do a continuing resolution. Let's not make a decision about how we should fund the National Park Service. What about the U.S. Copyright Office? For God's sake, what is there to fight over? Funding the Copyright Office. What about the Bureau of Engraving and Printing? There must be some catastrophic fight we're having because they're going to be under a continuing resolution. Food Safety Administration, the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. I am concerned and want to make it clear that I profoundly appreciate the leadership of Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Lowy for trying to be responsible and get the job done. But if this continuing resolution is passed as is until December 15th, I have a profound fear that our colleagues will be so exhausted from lurching to another crisis next month that we will do a CR for the rest of the fiscal year and we will never go back to doing a governance of this country. I yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Financial Services Appropriations Subcommittee, gentleman from Florida, Mr. Crenshaw.
Gentleman from Florida recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you for using the time. Chairman Rogers, thank you for your leadership in this very difficult appropriations process. I think everybody agrees that the appropriations process is one of the most important functions of this Congress, if not the most important. And while we would all like to be here, having finished all the appropriations bills, there just wasn't quite enough time. And so all we're asking today is for the members to adopt this continuing resolution. It will continue funding the government for the next 3 months at the same level it was funded last year. That will give us the time as the body to finish all the appropriations bills. Some have passed the subcommittee and the full committee. Some have passed this House. I know that the subcommittee that I chair, the Financial Services, we had a number of hearings. Members worked hard to try to set priorities, passed the subcommittee, passed the full committee, and is ready to go before the House. And there's some very important things in that bill. I think we've all heard the stories about the IRS and how they singled out individuals and groups based on their political philosophy and then subjected them to intimidation and bullying. And we were all outraged. And so in our bill, we make provision to say if we're going to hold you accountable and we're going to use the power of the purse and ask you to come clean. No more of this. We actually condition some of the funding to the IRS as to whether or not they will put in place the safeguards that have been recommended to make sure that they don't continue this kind of outrageous behavior, and also make sure it doesn't happen again. And so I think that we should pass this continuing resolution, fund the government for this short period of time, and put in place the spending bills that set priorities, that make the tough choices that we have to make in these difficult times. So I urge all my colleagues to vote yes on this continuing resolution. I yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized. The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Interior Subcommittee on Appropriations. Gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Simpson.
The gentleman from Idaho is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I have to tell you that my good friend from Indiana, Mr. Voskowski's statement, I agree with him. In fact, most people sitting on the floor are on the Appropriations Committee and agree with him that we need to get back to the regular order. And I can tell you that our chairman and the ranking member have been trying to get us back to a regular order where we pass individual appropriation bills and get them done. So far, we haven't been able to do that. So it's necessary to do a short-term CR. I can tell you that we've heard over the last couple of days a lot of talk about Republicans trying to shut down the government. It's the last thing we want to do. If we wanted to do that, we wouldn't be doing a short-term CR. And the reason we're doing a short-term CR instead of a long-term CR is because we need to allow the Appropriations Committee to do their work, to finish their bills, to work with the Senate, get conference reports done, and do our individual bills. And that's what we're working on. We can't fall into the abyss of a long-term CR. As many know, and I'll give you an example, as many of you know, the West has been on fire this summer. In fact, our chairman was out in Idaho reducing the number of fish in our streams out there this summer. He saw the effects of the fires and what it's having in Idaho and throughout the West. We were able to get into this short-term CR $636 million additional dollars to fund the Forest Service and the BLM in forest firefighting costs. If we do a long-term CR, we lose that $636 million. If we do individual bills, we'll be able to keep it. But we need to get to a long-term or where we do individual appropriation bills so that we can have our priorities met. Some people think doing a long-term CR actually reduces spending. I will tell you that if you look at where we were last year with our bills that we almost got done and then ended up with a long-term CR, the EPA is spending about $75 million more this year than they would have under the bills that we would have passed. So if you think that's the way to save money, it's not. We need to do our job. While I was talking about Forest Firefighting Service, I have to tell you, since I've got the floor for a minute, how proud I am of the work that the Forest Service did, the contractors with the Forest Service, the hotshot crews from across the country. I met with some of them from Tennessee. I knew they were from Tennessee because they spoke funny. But they did an amazing, amazing job, and we ought to be proud of the work they do, and we ought to make sure they have the resources to fight these wildfires. I appreciate it. Let's pass this short-term CR, keep the government operating, and let the appropriations finish their job.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized. The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. Madam Speaker, a single mother in Houston, Texas wrote me this letter. The Affordable Care Act is affecting my family. I am a single mother. I have raised 5 boys on my own. I currently work 2 jobs to keep up with my monthly mortgage and utility bills. This is because my primary employer would not hire me to work more than 29 hours per week, thanks to Obamacare. Now I have to work 7 days a week at 2 jobs to make ends meet. While I am thankful I have these jobs, I am unable to provide supervision and guidance I feel my son needs and deserves to be successful. I had to make a tough decision that I did not want to make. My son is now living with relatives in another city. I am depressed that Obamacare has begun to tear my family apart and also has put an unhealthy burden on me. Madam Speaker, real person, real tragedy. It's time to free Americans from the shackles of Obamacare, defund Obamacare, and tell the Senate to do the same. And that's just the way it is.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized. The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the State Foreign Ops Subcommittee on Appropriations. Gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Granger.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to speak. Thank you for the hard work you put into the bills in our committee. I rise in support of the continuing resolution to keep the federal government operating through December the 15th. And we hope this resolution will give the Congress and the White House time to come together on a comprehensive budget agreement. I chair the State Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee, and funding the bill directly supports U.S. national security. The world has never been a more dangerous place, and to cut back our diplomatic activities at this time would be irresponsible. Failure to get a CR enacted would impact key posts including Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. This would mean dramatically reduced influence in key regions like the Middle East and Asia. Military assistance to our allies, such as Israel, could be affected if payments are not made as planned, potentially jeopardizing the readiness of our partners. This could also impact the U.S. jobs of the men and women producing American-made equipment. 1 year ago, terrorists attacked and killed Americans in Benghazi. Failure to pass this CR could delay implementation of the Benghazi Accountability Review Board recommendations and jeopardize the safety of our diplomats who continue to serve abroad. It's important that we pass this CR today and the Senate consider it as quickly as possible. It's a basic function and the responsibility of Congress to keep the government open and working for the people who elected us. This bill simply does that. I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote yes, and I yield back my time to the chairman.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
We reserve as well. No, here's someone else.
The gentleman from Kentucky.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Commerce Justice State Subcommittee on Appropriation. Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank Chairman Rogers for moving this bill. It is very important. I rise today in strong support for H.J. Res. 59, providing continuing appropriation for the initial weeks of fiscal year 2014 through December 15th. This bill is needed to keep vital government services and programs operating past the end of the current fiscal year on September 30th. As the gentleman from Kentucky has stated, the Committee on Appropriations has made significant progress in moving annual appropriation bills. However, additional time is needed to allow for the prompt completion of our fiscal 2014 appropriation work. This resolution continues for discretionary programs at the current post-sequestration level, including critical programs under the jurisdiction of the CJS subcommittee, such as the operation of the federal prison system. You can't shut down the federal prison system. The FBI counterterrorism activities. The FBI team that's working with regard to Benghazi, as the former spokesman said, also working on counterterrorism. The weather forecast. We have seen major storms hit this nation all the way in the past year. To shut that down and the warnings and the satellite programs that they depend upon and also for the continued development of NASA's space exploration programs. Our nation is in serious financial trouble, and it is well past the time that we put everything on the table, including entitlements, and agree on a long-term budget solution, which includes an end to sequestration. Hopefully, the 76 days provided in the resolution by the chairman will be enough time for an overall agreement to be reached and also to allow us to pass regular appropriation bills for FY14. I urge my colleagues and all members of the Congress to support the CR, avoid a devastating government shutdown, and create a window of time for the Congress to fulfill a basic constitutional duty, the appropriation of funds for government programs and services. I thank the Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
We reserve.
The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the Agriculture Subcommittee on Appropriations. Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. ADERHOLT.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Rogers, for giving the opportunity to speak in support of H.J. Res. 59, which is the FY14 continuing resolution. Of course, I think it's very obvious by the comments that the Republicans have made on our side this morning that we do need to keep the government opening at its current sequestered funding level and continue to provide the vital services that our constituents have grown to expect and from government, and certainly make sure that we don't have a government shutdown. As Chairman Rogers mentioned, I chair the Appropriations Subcommittee on Agriculture, and some may ask, why is it so important that we keep the government open? Can't we just go with another year-long CR? I'd like to provide some reasons why the FY14 Ag Approach Bill that passed the committee provides great benefits to the taxpayer, and why we don't need to go to a year-long CR, and certainly why we don't need to do a government shutdown. In the Ag Appropriations Bill, we direct the states to be in full compliance with WIC and SNAP eligibility standards, and we increase oversight of vendors to rein in the cost. We require the USDA to report on strategies that are being implemented to help weed out fraud, waste, and abuse in the SNAP program. One thing that I hear a lot about is about the new school meal regulation. We want to provide more flexibility for local school districts as they implement these new school regulations for meals for the students. We require the Commodity Future Trading Commission to develop cost-benefit analysis of several of the Dodd-Frank provisions that are deemed to be duplicative and also very costly. We encourage the USDA to finalize an inspection rule that has proven to decrease illness-causing pathogens in poultry operations at a reduced federal cost. And I can tell you, representing that district that grows a lot of poultry and that produces a lot of poultry, that is very important. So in closing, Madam Chair, let me just say I fully support H.Res. 59 and ask for my colleagues to do the same.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to this distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Stoll.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank Ranking Member Lowy. And Madam Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this radical right-wing effort to walk our economy off of a cliff and cause a government shutdown. I invite my colleagues on the other side to wake up from this radical ideological wet dream and come back to reality. It's time for us to come to the negotiating table. It's time for us to talk about what we can do to avoid a government shutdown. It takes health care coverage away from millions of people by blocking funding for Obamacare. This is the 42nd attempt to do so, and there is absolutely, as we all know, zero chance of it happening. It makes sure that we had paid China first before we pay people in this country, should the right wing continue to demand defunding Obamacare at all costs and force a first-ever U.S. failure to pay its own bills. We all know how this should end. There's a way to fund the government which would pass this chamber with votes from both sides of the aisle. I can only hope that the Republican leadership will eventually listen to the pleas from the Americans in my district and in the whole country and pursue this bipartisan effort. Until then, I urge all members to oppose this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank the chairman, the gentleman from Kentucky, for yielding. And, Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this bill to continue to fund government while also defunding the President's health care law and ensuring that this country does not default on its debts. And while some might criticize this effort, this is not a Republican idea. Talk to union leaders. James Hoffa says that the President's health care law is destroying the middle-class family in the 40-hour work week. In fact, the President himself has acknowledged that this law that his Senate author of the bill calls a train wreck when the President said that he wants to delay components of the law, but only for the privileged class, only for those people that can get access to the White House. We're fighting to give that same relief to all American families. This law is unworkable. It's killing jobs in America. It's causing people to lose good health care that they have today. In Louisiana alone, our families are facing over 50% increases in their health care premiums because of this law that's devastating our economy. It's not ready for prime time. The President's even acknowledged it. He's signed 7 bills to defund or repeal components of the law himself. It's time this House takes action, and then the Senate does their job and takes action as well. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves.